today just because Damien actually has to go to the airport this evening yet, so we'd like to have enough time for him to do Q&A after his presentation before he flies off. So thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank the Nerdery for the space and the pizza, and thank Tori and Ryan, who isn't here, for recording these meetings. I don't know if you know this, but the last couple meetings have been recorded and uploaded to YouTube, and you can access them from the website. I'd also like to thank Bo, raise your hand, who redid the IGDA.tc.org website in the last couple weeks. It looks great, so thank you to Bo for doing that for us. I'd also like to let you guys know, some of you know this already, we have a mailing list now that replaced our Google list group. There's a link on the website to sign up for the mailing list. It's like a Postman, old school Linux type mailing list, but it will do. Also a reminder that Tori, Ryan, and I do a monthly podcast for the IGDA-TC. You can reach it on iTunes. If you do a search for, I think, IGDA or IGDA-TC, you should be able to find it pretty easy. There's also a link to it on the website. We will have a late April happy hour. We're going to start doing on the bi-weeks between meetings, doing just like a social gathering, meeting up at a bar. We met up at the Chatterbox a couple weeks ago. That was really fun. So we'll probably continue to do that for those who would like to still do the happy hour but have to leave early because of various reasons, like maybe getting up early in the morning for your job. So you can't go to the happy hour after these meetings. We have an event coming up in May 11th. I'm not sure if it's going to be here or somewhere else, but there'll be some data about that on the website shortly. And for those of you who are interested, the IGDA org has a Scrum certification in Chicago that's going to be happening on June 2nd, and you can find out more about that on the IGDA.org site. And then afterwards, we'll be meeting at Joe Sensors for drinks. That's tonight, not June 2nd. Okay, so with that, those are my announcements. I'd like to introduce Damien Kaspar. He is a freelance technical sound designer working at the Bay Area sound department, right? Pulling off cool implementation tricks, experimenting with noise, and spreading the word about interactive audio. His contributions to the art of implementation can be heard in Conan, Star Wars, The Force Unleashed, and The Saboteur, among others, while additional articles on technical sound design can be found linked at www.lostchocolatelab.com. So, Damien, thanks.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, everyone, for coming. It's great to be part of the IGDA meetings and to have such a cool community in town to round up with on a regular basis. I've been coming to the meetings here in town for the last year and a half that I've been back, and then prior to the 3 years I spent out in the Bay Area, helped to organize and work with Gary Dahl on the chapter prior to that. And so it's great to see it grow to the size that it is today, and it's great to have this space to hang out and talk about cool stuff in games. So thanks to everyone for coming, and I can't wait to see your presentations in the future. The one last month was great as well. Big John Games, if you were here, did a great presentation on some of the cool stuff they're doing, and so it's definitely a great chapter to be a part of. It's good to be here. So thanks. Today I'm going to kind of reprise a talk that I gave at the Game Developers Conference this last month about footsteps in games. And I guess, has anyone ever noticed footsteps in games? Okay. Has anyone ever heard good ones? Probably. How about bad ones? Yeah. Okay. Plenty of bad ones, bad examples out there. And while, we may not solve all those problems today, I guess we're going to maybe take a wide-angle view of some developing trends and look at some genres and kind of break down some specifics that are happening out there and kind of look at some ways that we might, move that forward. So I guess, hands up, who is working with sound maybe in games? Even from a gameplay level where you're tying in sounds to your game. who works expressly, let's say, in animations? Okay, a couple maybe animators out there. Right, so I mean, audio touches all of these different aspects, whether it's animation or level design, environmental art, game design, obviously, cascades through all these different areas, and really it comes together in Footsteps because you have things like animations that are firing off footstep sounds or Foley movement. You have surfaces in the world that may or may not be tagged with material type info, and so you've got a lot of different things coming at an audio system in order to play back the sound appropriately. So it really runs a thread through all the different types of game design. In the talk, we're going to try and cover a few of the different genres. We're going to take a little historical look back at where Footsteps have come from. We're going to see some examples and hear some examples across a couple of different types of genres. We're going to talk a little bit about the difference between maybe what's called a realistic sound or an iconic or symbolic sound. And so I'll try to dig into what that actually means over the course of the talk. And then we're going to talk about a few tricks that you might employ in order to get better sound from your footsteps, because they do matter. But first we're going to kick it off with a little retro-inspired video that I made to help illustrate this. right, so some cool examples there across the pages, and we've come a long way from the bleeps, the bloops, the white noise, but footsteps have been around in games for a long time, right? So in an average 50 or 60 hour game, you might be subject to 50 or 60 hours of footsteps, and so they demand attention. I think that we're just trying to say that that they demand to be heard appropriately, and there's a lot of cool examples of how it's done right in this day and age. So just quickly some fundamentals, right? We've got a few different options for how we play games these days. These are only a couple, but the difference between a first and a third person implementation of footsteps. In a first person, you might not have feet. You might not see them. And so the implementation of footsteps is going to be very different than an animation-based system, where you might take a animation and put a tag for the footstep to be able to play off of. You probably heard in a couple of occasions, the Psychonauts one maybe being the quickest example of that, but the transition between material types from a concrete street to a dirt path. You might have also heard things during the Wii Fit example of running. They were doing some pitch-based, based on how fast your character's running. Okay, these are all kind of concepts that are being employed. Different step types. We'll start to see other examples of current games where they're doing more than just walking or running, where they're jumping from rooftops or up and down walls. And these are all different animations usually that get tagged with a specific sound or a specific group of sounds in relation to the action that's playing out. And so what we start to see is coming from the single instance bleep, bloop, white noise burst to these more complex systems where you're trying to take a kind of granular approach, or a small chunks of sound approach, and kind of lining them all up to be this bigger movement. More towards what we're doing today. So a lot of different step types. So walk and run, those were easy ones. Can anyone think of any other kinds of stepping that we might do in a game or in the world? Different shoes. Different shoe types, sure. Jumping, landing, yeah, two very different sounds, right? Right? Okay, so jump, there's very little sound, maybe the sound of your feet leaving the ground, but then landing is, sometimes a two-footed affair. You could probably jump on one leg. Anyone want to see that? Okay. Sounds a little different, right? 1 foot, 2 foot, a little different. So, sliding, great example. Absolutely, tricky one. There's just this thing, like when you turn the corner, you actually just kind of scuff. You just kind of pivot your foot a little bit and it scuffs. These are all things that when you're tagging an animation with all these individual little sounds, you're breaking these up into little compartments and making sure that not only does it make the sound, but it makes the appropriate sound at the appropriate time, and that there's enough diversity within, let's say, that selection of sounds, so that you don't hear the same thing over and over, because the mind is very key to hearing repetition. And so a lot of the techniques and a lot of the direction of games that are attempting to approach realism are working in these directions towards having multiple sound files to describe a certain action, or bringing material-based content into the mix, different step types. All of these things help to form this more holistic representation of the movement that's going on. So what I did is I started this study. It's informal, and it's just like, what do I have laying around that I can look at and listen to and kind of focus in on. So I looked at about a dozen games in the current generation, and just with an ear towards footstep sound, to see how it was being handled and what they were doing that was interesting. And one of the first things that I kind of happened upon is that I ended up with three games that kind of, in some ways, define a current genre in video games that I like to call kind of the Parkour free running type of game. And now we've had platformers forever, right? We've always been jumping from here to there, and so it's not a new thing, right? But somehow I happened across three games: Assassin's Creed 2, Mirror's Edge, and Prince of Persia, one of the more recent ones. Not the Wii version, but that kind of cel-shaded, cool one that they put out a couple years ago. And so I just kind of was like, hold on a second, these are Footstep games. Why wasn't I informed, right? But these are games that, while maybe not necessarily all about footsteps, really movement and footsteps play a really central role to playing, right? Because part of the goal of them is to feel like you're awesome traversing this world and pulling off the cool tricks, right? Mirror's Edge, you can play the whole game without ever taking down a bad guy. You can just run through that level using your wits and skills, and I thought that very much spoke to this quote on Parkour, which is, you know, certainly a trend or a fad or a sport, one of those three things or all of them. And I thought, wow, that's kind of cool to see. And as I kind of dug in more on it, I started to see some things emerge as far as patterns in that. And so I guess before I run the video on it, which will kind of give you a little bit of an example of what I started to experience, let me just say that of the three games, they all present a very different aesthetic of footsteps. They're very different. They all approach it in a different way. Some with more of an ear towards realism, and some with more of an ear towards communicating something. Others with a very stylized degree of presentation. So I'm going to play the video. You can kind of soak that in, and then I'll spew a little bit about what I thought was cool about these three different games, all within kind of the Parkour free running genre, if you will. So I think that what's cool about that is that it shows three very different perspectives on this idea of running throughout a world. Assassin's Creed 2, even the new Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, this is a very realistic representation of footsteps and movement in the world. They're doing all kinds of crazy animation blends. The feel of traversing the world is very, tactile, and so they have a lot of opportunities to tag all those unique animations with tiny snippets of sound in order to fill out the overall character of the guy jumping around in the world. Right? Very realistic sound. Lots of variations of different surface types. You could hear jumping on the stone versus running across the rooftops. Very tile sounding, right? So, okay, very much my current representation of realism in games for sound of movement and footsteps. Take a step back, and if you listen to the sound of the footsteps for Mirror's Edge, while they also have a very high degree of realism to it, much the same as their stark contrast visual design, their sound design also has a very clean aesthetic to it. It sounds very different than the organic and realistic sound of Assassin's Creed. Now, still realistic, still extremely realistic, to the point where after my talk, Ben Minto from DICE, who put out Mirror's Edge, came over and shared with me that contrary to where you would normally use a microphone to record a footstep, Carly, where would you normally mic a footstep, do you think? Let's say you're doing Foley on the Foley stage.
Probably down that stage.
Sure. I think the initial assumption is, and you're going to get the cleanest, hottest recording if you put the microphone right down by the foot. Interestingly, in their process, they found that that by putting the microphones actually up at the ears, that they got a more realistic representation of it, and which kind of boggles the mind. The same went for breathing sounds, right? Pretty much, Audio 101 is put the microphone right in front of your voice cage and start breathing, right? You're going to get the best signal-to-noise ratio. It's going to be the cleanest. But they said, the proximity effect of having microphones up at your ears and doing that recording made it sound more realistic. Okay, these are very, these are choices that they're making in order to represent the audio. And I think that they speak to the aesthetic of the game and what they were going for overall. Okay, so now Prince of Persia, right? There's a little bit of both here going. They have a lot of reality, a lot of realism running around in the world as you're jumping from wall to wall, feeling cool for pulling off all the hot tricks, right? But there's also a lot being communicated through sound as you're moving through this world. You might have seen in the video where you're lurping up the wall and grabbing out of the rings, okay? Each time you grab one of those rings, it's a very similar sound. In fact, they almost sound the same, okay? Same thing jumping from pillar to pillar. You grab it, flip around it, you jump off it. It's very similar sounding, if not the same. And in that way, they've chosen. Okay, they could throw a bunch of variation, they could make it sound different every time, but they've very specifically chosen in those moments to communicate what you've accomplished. They've given you the audio cookie, if you will, and said, you did it. What's next? And so in that way, they're kind of leading you along in these moments of success with sound. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing to emerge out of this. Here we're looking at 3 games. They may be different, gameplay-wise, certainly different aesthetically, but they all involve moving through the world. But they all have paint a different picture with audio and how they communicate that to the player. So that was cool. Wow! I'm like, didn't expect that. Do you have a question?
Yeah, I was interested in when I was listening to the sounds. I was wondering how the sounds of the footsteps related with the actual character and the demographic as well. Because the guy running around Assassin's Creed, he had almost like a heavier sound to him, like this weight as a bigger person, and then you have the woman, Mirror's Edge. And it was, I didn't say how he would feel, but it was very sharp. And I was just thinking about how that plays with the actual character. It makes you
Absolutely, right? Who are you going to record running around like an assassin? Like a dude that looks the same and has the same weight and heft, right? Versus the other side of it. So this is another factor, right? What is the, what's the mass of the person? Do you feel that when you're moving around, and does it represent the same?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. You've got to be pretty powerful to lift this whole body up and fly across there.
Yeah.
Have such a heavy flying style to it.
Totally. Well, and you've seen that some of that Parkour stuff on TV these days, right? They're jumping around, and it's a sport. It's full-on X game magic, right?
Yeah. I was just thinking about. Sorry, I was thinking about two other games, and I was wondering. Would be interesting. I don't know if I paid attention, but it sounds like, for example, NBA 2K versus NBA Jam. Yeah. How different would they sound between each other? Just those stylized athletes. Fairly realistic on basketball.
Sure. I'd love to dissect some sport game sound. I don't do enough of them, so I would love to hear more about them. Cool. Well, okay. So that was kind of that genre. I was like stepping back from all these videos that I made and all this time that I spent, and I was like, whoa, okay, that's kind of cool. So from there, I started jumping onto this squad-based thing. I realized, hold on a second, there's this thing happening with games where now it's not just one person running around, but now you might be commanding a squadron of people who are backing you up. Holy, what happened? Now it went from being this simple, system of one step here, one step there, maybe some, enemies off in the distance doing their thing, to having a troop of people trucking around behind you. And it became clear after dissecting it a little bit that there were some inherent challenges with that, right? It's not just as easy as taking up those animations and, stringing these people behind you. And so I got to look at it. I got to dig it. We didn't hear a whole lot of it in that Prince of Persia clip, but there's also a companion character that runs around after you, right? And if you're moving fast, she keeps a pretty steady distance, and you probably won't hear her unless you slow down and wait. However, a couple other games that are very squad-based become a little more domineering and become more a part of the constant cacophony that surrounds you throughout gameplay. So I put up this quote by Walter Murch, a famous sound guy, and I think you all can read, and so I'm not going to belabor it necessarily, but I think that the point that it's trying to make is that when you have a group of people running together, sync becomes less of an issue. You're more concerned with the sound of it and does it sound appropriate. And so very much in the viewing of these next clips, ask yourself, does it sound appropriate? Okay? Right, so also tagged on the end of this clip is my favorite topic, the iconic, earconic, symbolic sound discussion. And this kind of opens up the door a little bit, but we've already touched on it in talking about those Prince of Persia sounds, where they're communicating something to you, okay? And in the Prince of Persia examples, I can grok it, right? They want to give you the indication that you've succeeded, you've successfully grabbed that ring, what are you going to do next? Very clear to me, okay, that makes sense, I got it. In the example I'm going to show here of a game that was an Xbox launch title, I believe, called Lost Odyssey. It's a Japanese RPG. And, from the ashes of some Final Fantasy guys, going to be the new hotness, whatever. Played it for a while, and I realized, dissecting it for this video, they're only using 2, maybe 4 variations of footsteps, and they're not actually doing anything to randomize the volume of it to get diversity in how loud each of the footfalls are. They're not doing anything to the pitch of it in order to make them sound just a little bit different, slightly different every time. Again, trying to trick the ear into not hearing that repetition. And so I came to feel like there was a conscious choice on the part of the developers to limit themselves to this small set of footsteps. However, the right footsteps for their game. And you can hear a little bit of that in the clip. Again, I think it was an aesthetic choice that they made. We have the technology, right? And yet, they made this choice, I feel like, for a reason. So you can kind of hear the difference between these clips and hopefully either help me understand or nod your head with me in some way.
I was almost positive.
So, lots of stuff going on there, but again, the ladder climb at the end, it's tick-tock of the clock, okay? It's 2 footsteps. It's pretty clear to hear that. Some of the other examples on the surface types may be less able to register that in a short period of time. But this is a JRPG. You're going to play this game for 50 to 100 hours, okay? You're going to either love those footsteps or hate them, okay? Because they have chosen the exact ones to represent that step type for you. And it was a conscious choice. I think that it's cool that they made that choice. I want to think that it's not just a holdover from the PS2 days when you only had 2 mega RAM for audio. I want to think that they're making that choice for a reason. So, cool, right? Dragon Age. Okay, that is an interesting thing they got going, right? Here's a game where you can change shoe type, you can change armor type, you can change shoe type and armor type on your squad members. And so you have all these different choices. When you change these things, the sound changes. And so you have all of this ability as a player to customize your experience. Now, right, you're usually making those customizations for the purposes of, you know, slaying dragons and whatnot and making sure that everyone's got what they need to get through the battle. But at the same time, if the footsteps are bugging you and you swap everyone out to leather shoes, maybe it's a little less annoying. Okay? Interesting thing in Dragon Age. Now, I think that they've probably moved on from this, but one interesting part of the video might have been hard to hear. It was flagged at the bottom of the screen, but the companion character, I put it, you know, some heavy plate on and chainmail and, you know, loud stuff. And then on the player character, it was all leather and casual. You can hear when he's walking slowly through that corridor, the AI for that companion character kind of hustle and catch up. He'll take a few steps, stop, wait for you to move a little further, hustle a little bit more, stop, wait, and keep hustling along. It's not every player that's going to necessarily expose that weak AI or pathfinding AI, but with the sound tweak in that way, it made it kind of apparent that the AI was struggling to keep up, but struggling to do what it needed to do in an effortless way. Other side of the coin, over in Mass Effect 2, they had definitely done some thinking about it. You've got two other companion characters behind you. As they're running along, everything is echoing in a chorus that makes perfect sense. So, interesting perspectives on the squad-based mechanic. Again, I think that they were making some choices there in Lost Odyssey. They were making those choices as a way to kind of say, these are the ones that we want you to listen to. Counterpoint to that. So there was a game a million years ago called, what was it called? What was the game before Obsidian? No, the game before Oblivion. Elder Scrolls, Morrowind. Right. Okay, so Morrowind had one of the first kind of traversable islands that you could walk across from point A to point B in real time. Right? And so you could do this. You could walk across the island. It would take an hour, I don't remember how long. It would take a while, right? It's a real island, right? Each step matters. Well, how many footsteps are you going to hear on that walk across your island? And we're talking not the current generation, but a couple generations ago. You're going to hear a lot of footsteps, okay? They're all going to be full volume, and maybe you're going to get some variation, but okay. So later on in that game, you actually get the power to levitate and fly around that world. Okay? Here's some unsubstantiated speculation, but moving forward into Oblivion and then Fallout 3, Bethesda implemented a footstep slider for the sound of the UI, for the sound in the UI. So you go in there, and normally in games you get a music, sound, and voice, right? They got one for footsteps in it. You can turn that up or down depending on taste. So I don't want to draw the lines for them, and I haven't talked to anyone there, but I got to think that, it might have been an issue. And so they implemented this volume slider for the volume of footsteps. I haven't seen it anywhere else. Other interesting things, companion characters, right? Fallout 3 New Vegas, you can quest for 15 hours and get this robot companion dog. I talked to a guy who was like, man, I wanted that dog so bad, I ran through all the missions and got it. And then when I got it, its footsteps were so loud, I disengaged it. I couldn't take it. It was too loud. Footsteps. They're just footsteps, right? But they matter. And so a lot of interesting examples of how they're being handled and or mishandled at times. So 2 other quick ones. This multiplayer thing. Any multiplayer people out there? Okay, yeah. Any Counter-Strike people still left in this world? Yeah, okay. Well, it's a common thing out there on the graphics side of things to take and roll all your graphics all the way down, right? In order to be competitive in that space, right? We don't need no stinking graphics. We want the frame rate, right?
You're sending us the VPN.
Twitch game. Okay. There, once upon a time, was a hack that you could enable that swapped out the footstep sounds, which, if you're a multiplayer guy, will give you positional information as to where, the attackers are. Swap those out with little sine waves and test tones, just little beeps, and all of a sudden that just becomes all the more distinct as to where your enemies are located. Now you can position them in 3D space really well, because it's not surface dependent anymore. It doesn't have anything to do with any of that. It's just straight up locational, almost like sonar. Okay? So I thought that that was really interesting. One of the guys from Valve was telling me about how they had to put in a cheap fix for that to keep people from dropping their own sine tones in for multiplayer. And I was like, seriously? Footsteps? All right, cool. Right, so it's got all these things to it. Okay, the other side of this. Indies, right? We've got a lot of indies in this town. A lot of people making smaller games or uniquely aesthetic games. And 3 indies that have done some really interesting things with Footsteps. Cannibal, Super Meat Boy, Limbo. Cannibal, anyone played that? Yeah. Run across the screen, right? What more fun could you ask? You jump over these little things, and as soon as you fall off the building, it's game over. But as many miles as you can run across these rooftops, it's a good time, right? The game is very pixel. It's very black and white. It's got an aesthetic. They couldn't do much realistic with what they had. They were making, I think it's a Flash game. And so they leaned on sound to bring in this realism, right? They've got 2 surface types for footsteps in this game. Concrete and metal girder, right? Realistic representations. They've got, real sounds for things breaking. There's a great video online talking with Adam Atomic, the creator of that game, and Danny B, who did the sound and music for it. And he's talking about, the game itself visually had a very clear aesthetic. But with sound, they chose to go with this heightened level of realism, and it helped people bridge that gap between what they were seeing and what they were experiencing. And so this realism of sound that they add to the mix, again, Footsteps, not a bad thing. Super Meat Boy, anyone play that game? That was my game of the year last year. A guy named Jordan Fair did the sound design work for it. And Meat Boy makes these super meaty sounds when he walks. No surprise, right? Super splotchy and kind of gross, but totally appropriate, okay? It sounds great, okay? Kind of weird, but cool. And Limbo. Anyone Limbo out there? Xbox Live. This was a black and white game with a very old world, silent movie kind of feel to it. The sound designer composer gave a talk at GDC this year and really wrapped up his aesthetic of the whole thing. It's very hard to tell in that game what is music and what is sound because of the way that he chooses to interleave it. But one thing I thought was really interesting is that the main character is a little boy that runs through the level. He's got to have some footsteps, right? Well, not only does he have footsteps, but he's got 12 interactive mix states for how those footsteps sound. Either sometimes louder, sometimes quieter, sometimes pitched down to sound heavier, maybe sometimes with more reverb. That's a lot of thinking about something simple like footsteps. And so this is, again, an Xbox Live game. They're doing some interesting things with footsteps. They're thinking about it deeply. And so, not to be underestimated, the power of the footstep. So, hot tips. We got this idea of randomizing, right? We've got variation, we've got 6, we've got 12 of a certain step type. We've got all these different kinds of steps. We've got walk and run and scuff and jump and land. We're going to do some volume variation. We're going to do some pitch variation. Low pass filter is maybe shaving off a little bit of the high end once in a while. That helps you, again, get variation. Each time one of these sounds is triggered, it's going to make a different choice. What volume am I going to be at? What pitch am I going to be at? What kind of roll off on the high end am I going to have? These are all things that will help you take however much space you have carved out for content with regards to this footstep and movement sound, and then extend them. Okay? Other cool things that we fit example of running. Taking the velocity of the player and pitching based on that velocity. It gives you this impression that you're speeding up. And so tying directly to that game parameter can really help. One thing I'm interested in, and I haven't experimented much with, is this idea of a delay offset. Do we have any joggers out there? All right, some people who've maybe done some syncopated running. I won't put a label on it. Other than the two of you, how many of us walk in perfect time? Probably not very often. And yet, every game that is made, for the most part, walks in perfect syncopation 100% of the time. And so, that might be okay when we're grooving along to techno, and that might be okay because games are games and not real life. But where I live, I never walk in time. I always got some crazy gangsta lean. Who knows, right? And so this idea of a delay offset might need to start at the animation level, right? But this idea that maybe instead of having a totally locked groove, syncopated footstep, we have a little more variation to the timing of them. Okay. And then granularity. Just this idea that you can break things up into these tiny little pieces. A scuff here, a step there, a little Foley rub here, a little rub there, right? Tiny little pieces tagged on these animations, all firing off to make this bigger whole. So, okay, we've gone through history, talked about a few genres, did some examples of different ways to do things, how different people are making different choices. The bottom line, from where I'm standing, is that footsteps are kind of a big deal. In a 30 to 60 hour game, you might hear 30 to 60 hours of the same 4 files. So, maybe you're not making a game with footsteps. Okay, give it the appropriate attention. If you're making a game that's Parkour free running, maybe it matters a little bit more than if you're making, obviously a racing game, right? But give it the appropriate attention for whatever the game is that you're making. And blaze the trail. Do things differently. Take the risk and try to diversify your content, try to do something different, try to give it a level of importance, or choose an aesthetic that is directly in contrast to what other people are doing, but that absolutely fits your game. Limbo, again, perfect example. Here's a black and white, almost silent movie-esque game. The centerpiece, I would argue in some cases, are the footsteps. These are the things that root you to that world. And so, do something different with it. Give it 12 different mix states. Make it sound different over the course of the game. Okay? So, with that, a bunch of other links if you want to dig in deeper on it. The study I wrote with all the video examples are online. We had some smart people get together and talk about Footsteps and Foley on a thing called the Game Audio Podcast that I helped coordinate. A lot of smarter people than me have written articles about Footsteps, and there's a cool post about iconic sounds where people contribute to, sounds that are cool for them. As a parting note, I'm going to try to play you this video. No promises, though. This Mac is kind of old. because my battery's dead. Thank you. Cool. Thanks a lot, everyone. Does anyone have questions? Oh, yeah. David, go ahead.
Okay. I know in film sound, the footsteps are kind of one of the first things to get introduced when movie producers were like, something's not right. I think Jack Foley is the person who started that, which is why we call it Foley. But did you look at the history in film at all while you're doing your studies?
No.
I think you'd find some interesting stuff in there.
I bet. No, I live a little bit outside that film world, and while I appreciate it deeply, I didn't dig into it much. I'm fascinated by where we have been in games, and despite coming from a different discipline, how we end up in some of the same discussions. So, no, but I'd read some more about it.
If you continue to read, there's some good stuff in the film practice, because they started a lot of that stuff in.
Oh yeah, there's a lot to learn from other disciplines, that's for sure. Cool.
Yeah, I was curious because you were talking about footsteps so much. I was wondering about games that don't use footsteps.
They exist.
I think of I play Sonic the Hedgehog.
Yeah.
He gets full speed, you're going to hear a million footsteps. I don't think that in the whole game. It's just kind of gone. And I was wondering how they would vary that in and out for a person who just runs all the time.
Right. It's a good question, right? In some cases they might just, fade down the footsteps after 2 minutes or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Maybe you don't need them. Certainly, if you're in the middle of a firefight, the footsteps are the last thing that you need to hear, right? So maybe you make some choices about what, when, and for how long. But back, the example at the end, the original Mario Brothers didn't have footsteps, right? So when you, can you imagine rescoring Sonic the Hedgehog with footsteps? It sounded obscene, right? There's definitely a case for it and a case against it. So, yeah. Probably sounds
how does the blending occur between footstep sounds? So you're running along and then you stop and slide or something like that. Is there some kind of fade that happens inside the game between them, or do they typically just overlap one another?
This is a good question, right? How do footstep sounds get triggered, and how do they play when they're being kind of overridden by other things or other steps, right? It kind of comes to the blend side of the animation thing, right? Because if your animation system is, has enough fidelity to be blending between all of these different animations that take you from running to stopping, which might include half a dozen animations along the way. The question becomes, well, where do you tag that sound? Okay. Once you've tagged that sound at the appropriate action on the animation, the question is, how do you let's say, crossfade between those things, right? How do you go from playing a hard step to a shuffle, right, within 15 frames or something like that, right? And I think that there are definitely some tools that allow for that. When you're switching between content types, you often have control over how you switch between that content. So, for instance, switching between a run step, a scuff, and let's say a shuffle. Okay? And within the tool, you might have the control to be able to say when you are getting all of these signals to do these different things, take a half second to blend between them. Okay? So usually a time-based crossfade, I think, is the solution to that. You could also then choose, well, if I get this interrupting signal, just cut that off and start this new thing, right? It's called maybe a behavior, right? As opposed to a crossfade. So if I go from landing to a shuffle, stop the landing sound and play the shuffle, it's more important than hearing the end of that landing. Did that answer your question?
Yeah. I mean, I was just kind of curious if there's some kind of standard way, some preferred way that it was typically done, because you could overlap the sounds, you could fade in between them, you could just do hard cuts on them to stop them, and
I think
start up the new one.
Yeah. I think that those are the most popular choices. But again, how you do that and what sounds good, I think, at the end of the day, rules that discussion. Right? But yeah, there's no one right way. Like, it takes experimentation to find the one that works for your game. Good question.
I think more games and research based on sound. Have you noticed a trend of quality of sound as far as like movement direction and being able to actually position where sound is coming from? Has that been changing at all? Is it pretty much still the same?
So I don't feel like there has been a lot of change in the 3D positioning of sounds. I feel like we still very much deal with sound in a mono point sourced 3D location, and that's sound emanating from that point source, usually in omnidirectional or 360 degrees. Right, so sound from this place where we say we want it to play just radiates from that point. That's, I think, usually how it's handled. We've got some fancier control to be able to direct that sound with sound cones, right? And say, okay, this is my mouth. If I'm talking this way, you can hear me good here, and as I turn around, it's a little more muffled. You're hearing more of the room. So we've got some of that. We also can cheat this a little bit because now we can take a mono source and we can choose to expand it using this control that a lot of tools have called a spread control. So that takes a mono sound and distributes it a percentage value to the adjacent speakers, right? Is that rocking a little bit? Okay, technically you take that mono sound and fold it out to all 5-1 speakers and hear it everywhere. Still the same mono sound, but you could expand it. The perfect example of this is like, so your classic burning fire pit, right? Every game's got to have them, right? Just like it's got to have a crate, okay? The burning fire pit. Historically, that is a mono point source, and it radiates in 360 degrees. Okay, that kind of makes sense. Except, when you put it in perspective of game audio, we have a single listener in the game. That's one set of ears, if you will, that listens for all the sound going on in the game, and then translates that to these 2 speakers, or 5 speakers, or 7 speakers. If you walk up next to that fire and are facing it with your, let's see, virtual ear to the right, you'll only hear that coming into your right, coming out of your right speaker. Okay? But in real life, we've got 2 ears. And so we're hearing the slightly delayed sound of that fire in our left ear as well. So, okay, spread kind of takes care of that a little bit. But I don't think things have changed 3D positioning too much as opposed to those couple 2 tricks. So I hope for more things like what they call head-related transfer function, which is that distance or the delay offset between ears, the whole binaural thing, which if anyone has ever checked out this YouTube video of like I think it's called the binaural haircut. Okay, you put on the headphones, and someone sits you down in a chair. It's a black screen, but they pretty much go through the motions of cutting someone's hair, and it gives you this, everything standing up in the back of your neck feeling, because the positioning of it is psychoacoustically tuned for headphones, so it sounds more real. So I guess I would hope for more of that in the future. I don't think it's more speakers, I think it's just a different way of handling that 3D position. Sorry, that was super geeky. Okay, more questions? Footsteps, good examples, bad examples?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, like, when you have sounds going on in the game environment that are coming from various sources, and they go to the speakers, now, in terms of, like, distance, you can determine the volume of it, so as you get closer to something, it's louder. Do you sort, like, in a third-person game where the camera's behind the character, do you get that information, the distance calculation, from where the camera is, or where the player's character is?
Awesome question. Awesome question. There's no one answer. You get that position from what they call the listener. And the listener can be placed on the camera. It can be placed on the player character. It can also be placed in between the two, which is a popular place to put the listener. You can also do a crazy thing. You play these games where they give you camera control. You can spin the camera around, right? So, okay, putting it on the camera there might be a little too intense. Putting it on the player might be a little too static. And so a lot of times, if the camera pushes and pulls in, they'll actually interpolate the listener between the player and the camera. So it moves on this rubber band, constantly stretching depending on where that camera is from the player character. So no one easy answer. It's just pretty much wherever it sounds best, I think, is the good answer.
Let's have an addendum to that. A really good example would be Supreme Commander. I don't know if you ever heard of that. Real-time strategy. Yeah. They had the mode where the camera would be zoomed out to like a map view, an overlay map or whatever, and you can zoom all the way in to like you're in the 3D world instead. And they had a really good way of shifting the audio from being it's like mono right when you're looking at the map, but when you zoom in, then it turns into the 3D or stereo, whatever. That was a really good implementation.
That real-time strategy genre comes with all kinds of challenges with regards to listeners. One of the first games that I really started digging deep into was a real-time strategy. And man, they got some challenges when it comes to that kind of thing. Because when you're zoomed out, you want kind of that cinematic experience of kind of watching it unfold. And then when you're down in the trenches, it changes, right? Good example.
Any games that do anything with walls and sound?
Sure. So the idea of obstruction and inclusion. Yeah, it's gaining traction. I will say that as recently as 2 or 3 years ago, it wasn't very common. We've had it for a long time, right? EAX is a reverb and environmental algorithm that's been on the PC since the mid-90s, right? They had obstruction and occlusion, but what it takes is bringing those numbers and those concepts into the game engine and actually defining those things in level geometry or in specialized geometry for giving those materials their properties, right? So we're starting to see more of it, absolutely. It's built into 2 of our big middleware tool sets, and a lot of companies are tying in their game designs to that in order to get those cool tricks. Yeah, we'd like to see more of it, but slowly. Yeah. It's all good.
I have a question. It's going to be quick. Have you were talking about the squad sounds?
Yeah.
I was wondering, did you ever try to listen to sounds from the Dynasty Warriors where there's a lot of people battling when they're following a character around? That was...
No, I love it.
Handle something like that.
I'd love to hear it. Again, I didn't come across it.
Okay, and there was a couple of games that went to my mind. Out of This World, Flashback, and I was thinking about how they would compare to games that are more music-based and almost like Streets of Rage, where you hear most of the music, and I wonder how games that are music-intensive compare to games that have little to no music, how it supports the sound effects.
Sure. Sure, well, and that's the discussion, right? How important are the footsteps? And you got to give them the credence, but...
Because I know that probably comes very popular, like guitar games, because you
Yeah.
I'm more interested in nice stuff.
Yeah, for sure. No, it's an interesting one.
The last thing was the Shadow of the Colossus. I was wondering, that same company, did they use any of that same similar sound to their first game, Pico?
No, I only played that game about an hour. Shadow of the Colossus I beat, but I only played Pico about an hour. It was too late for that one, and the control scheme was punishing, I felt like, as much as I wanted to love it, but I don't have a good comparison. I'm waiting for you. You dig into that, all right? And Dynasty Warriors, I want to know about that too. Yeah.
You asked if footsteps are important. When I have my gamer hat on, most of the time I consider footsteps part of the ambient sound. Sure. And I immediately go into options and go, 0, because I don't want to be distracted.
Yeah.
Of course, I play mostly multiplayers.
Sure.
But as an indie developer, I look into it and I go, okay, I'm putting all my efforts into all this other stuff. How much am I going to put into footsteps?
Yeah.
And I end up coming out like Lost Odyssey. Okay, I got 4 files here. Well, I'm going to repeat them,
Yeah.
And so I have been trying to shake them up with the variation and pitch and everything else like that.
Yeah.
As an indie, I look at it, that's a heck of a lot of resources put into that. I'm a 2-man crew or a 1-man crew trying to share this game. And they do get put to the side.
Yeah. I've put them to the side, admittedly, at times, because they're not important. They're not the focus. I think that rightly so. Sometimes you have to choose your battles. Right? I'm right there with you.
Do most companies go out and record their own footsteps, or is there like standard Foley libraries that maybe some of the games are killing?
I don't know of any Footstep libraries, and so I would have to answer that by saying, in my experience, people are recording their own. There's an interesting conundrum out there when you're making your choice for your files. You want them to sound uniquely different, however holistically similar. And there's something called the peg leg syndrome, if you ever get down to implementing Footsteps, where you'll throw a bunch of files into a folder and randomize them up, and one of those files will just sound like you're walking with a stilt. It'll just be part of the same batch, but it'll have a tonal quality that is completely out of place once you've heard it twice, 3 times, 4 times, to the point where you just only hear that file. And so a lot of people record their own so they can get that diversity and yet similarity so that it doesn't sound like a peg. Yeah.
Since we were talking about stylistic footsteps for a little bit, did you ever look at some non-human games, like maybe dig out your Mech Warrior from back in the days?
I like this idea. There's a great indie game right now called Hawken that's in pre-production, and they released a video the other day that had some awesome sounding robot footsteps. And so I can imagine, spending a couple years in the Bahamas playing Transformers games and Mech Warrior games and making videos. So if you're looking to fund that kind of research, I'm ready. So no, it would be great. I think it would be cool to focus in on that stuff.
Yay. You need an assistant for that trip.
I'll call you. Nice work on the website, bud. Cool.
Have you played any games? I can't think of the name of one specifically, but where they use the footsteps as part of the game, but instead of just their footsteps, they use them, like, especially games that have heavy music influences where the footsteps become part of the music. Whereas you're running, they kind of make a beat that kind of goes on, and it supports the music that's playing. I know there's a few that I've played that have done that, but I can't remember any specific names right now. But I was just wondering if you've ever come across that, or not something like that.
It rings a bell, but I can't think of anything particularly. You did kind of spark the imagination here. There's kind of a couple games that take footsteps and use them as an indicator for AI. So Splinter Cell and Thief, right? These are games that are kind of based on stealth, And so if you are traversing the world loudly, the AI will become alerted to you. It's actually aware of sound. And so while not necessarily directly triggered off of music, for instance, I wonder if Bit Trip Beat might be the game you're thinking of.
I'm not sure. I can't remember the games, but I know I've played a few where it's like you start running and you get going, and after a while it becomes sort of a beat that goes along with the music. And it's kind of an interesting thing instead of just like, some games where it's just sort of a side thing. It's actually worked in the flow of what's going on. It's really cool.
I like the idea, but I can hear it right now in my head. Yeah. When I'm walking around with the soundtrack and no iPod, I'm hearing that all the time. Because I'm walking 128 BPM. Always. It's the lead. Okay.
Have you looked at any games that don't include or maybe not games that don't have them, because there probably aren't many, but what the effect is of not having the sound of the footsteps in there? If you just remove footstep sounds?
No, but I think we could do it with Fallout 3 easy. They got the slider in the UI. We'll just take them out and see if it changes.
It kind of interesting to know what kind of effect of, how you perceive the gameplay.
Yeah, do you feel weightless because you're not rooted to that foot stepping down? I think that's the argument for footsteps, is that it helps ground you to the world. And so I'd be interested in whether that psychologically freaks you out. Marty?
I just read, there's a new gaming magazine for the iPad called Atomic Mag, and so I got that, and it's pretty cool. And one of the things they mentioned in one of the videos, so you have to kind of dig, but they're talking about this game, Papa Sangford.
Yep.
Have you heard of this?
Yep.
Yeah. So I haven't downloaded it, but I put it on my wish list because I was like, yeah, that sounds cool. So you won't. It's all audio. There's no visual to the game at all, and I don't know if footsteps are a big part of that or not.
I don't know either, but I've heard about the game, and I think it's a cool concept. It's an audio-only game, and you navigate it somehow.
Right.
But it's playable, right?
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, according to this magazine.
Yeah. No, I've heard good things about it as well.
There was another audio-only game for the Game Boy. I don't know if you played that one that I actually have. It's part of this series that they only made in Japan. They only came out as promotional for that tiny little Game Boy. I don't know if you remember that tiny one. There were a bunch of puzzle games, 4 or 5 puzzle games, and then this audio game that had it had graphics for a few seconds, and then it just faded out, and then you were just playing with the audio. Wow, that was a cool game.
Footsteps?
I don't think there were footsteps. I think it was more kind of music.
Gotcha.
It's kind of music-based.
Yeah. To that note, Electroplankton on the DS was an awesome, sound-only game. It had very little game to its sound, but it was a cool toy for sound. Yeah. Go ahead.
On the Xbox Live indie games, there's a game called Pit. No visuals whatsoever. It's completely footsteps, and he has 300 different sounds in that. Where you walk through the water and your footsteps get wetter and wetter sounds, and the deeper into the water you go. If you go too deep, the game will because you drown. And you walk into a wall and you hear the scuff marks and everything else, and he did a pretty good job of that, and it's completely footsteps.
This is a game where footsteps matter. Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. There was a great article recently about a visually impaired blind gamer who finished one of the Oddworld games using sound alone. So they were able to count the number of footsteps that it took to traverse a room and then use that in association with the sounds of hitting a wall or whatnot. It was, I guess, extremely well scored for that type of activity, and is able to complete that game without seeing at all. So sound, maybe sound, it makes a difference. Footsteps, only if you need them. But it's cool stuff. Well, thanks. Yeah.
You noticed any trends with, say, when a character is on horseback or a character has more than 2 feet?
No, another great area, right? The whole Shadow of the Colossus thing, the Red Dead Redemption. any game with a Western theme probably has horses, and no, I haven't dug into that side of it. It's a great place to explore more. I'll be in the Caribbean when you need me. I'll get back to you. Cool. All right. Well, thanks, everyone.